We are honored to have the opportunity to hear Air Commodore retired Leonard Birchall speak to us today on the topic of leadership. Air Commodore Birchall graduated from RMC in 1937 and was commissioned in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was a squadron leader and deputy commander of the 413 RCAF Squadron and was flying one of the lead aircraft that was transferred to Ceylon in early 1942. At the end of an all-day patrol southeast of Ceylon in search of submarines and shipping, he sighted the Japanese Navy fleet steaming towards Ceylon, preparatory to launching a surprise air attack on Colombo, Ceylon, similar to the one this same fleet had carried out on Pearl Harbor. He immediately sent off a signal giving the location, speed, course, and composition of the fleet. His aircraft was shot down by Japanese naval carrier fighter aircraft. However, his signal gave sufficient time to allow preparations to be made for the impending attack. The result was the British fleet was able to avoid destruction and the island to defend itself, inflicting severe losses on the Japanese naval aircraft. As a result of this action, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the title of Savior of Ceylon. Picked up by the Japanese Navy, he and the remnants of his crew were taken to Japan and placed in prisoner of war camps, where his conduct resulted upon his release in being awarded the Order of the British Empire for gallantry. As senior Allied officer in the camps in which he was located, he continually displayed the utmost concern for the welfare of his fellow prisoners. It is his time as a POW that he will share with us today. Air Commodore Birchall provides proof to us that it is essential to act ethically, even in the most life-threatening and complex circumstances. And his words give us a glimpse into the extraordinary life of this officer. Not just as a POW, but the way he has conducted himself throughout his life provides us with exceptional examples of ethics in practice. He has been dedicated to both the military and civilian communities. To the military community, he has donated his time as a permanent member and a reserve member. In fact, on 21st of April 1996, the Air Commodore completed 62 years of service with the Canadian Armed Forces and is the first member of the Canadian Forces to ever receive the 5th bar to the CD. He still gives lectures to Canadian Forces schools, speeches, and reviews parades. He has also been an active member of the civilian community and has been awarded the Order of Ontario for his achievements. While doing his duty as Canadian observer of the general election held in Sri Lanka, Air Commodore Birchall became aware of the terrible conditions in the Sri Lanka hospitals due to inadequate facilities and serious shortages of proper supplies and equipment. Upon his return to Canada, he organized and sent out a large sea container with over 8 tons of hospital supplies to Sri Lanka, and did so entirely at his own expense. Furthermore, in 1992, he became aware of a serious requirement for a suitable building at the local Girl Guide summer camp. He took over the project and had it designed and built at his own expense. Besides these notable examples, Air Commodore Birchall does volunteer work and assists in fundraising activities for many charitable organizations. His story needs to be told, and his example of Canadian values is a national treasure.
Can you hear me all right? Good. You all right in the back there? Last time I asked that question, some clown in the back said no, and everybody in the front got up and moved to the back. I apologize for my copious notes, but at my age and this past July I became 82 years young. There are 3 serious losses which you encounter in your physical capabilities. First, your eyesight goes dim, and you will note the rather strong lenses in my glasses. Second, your hearing is not too good, and I admit that I am in great need of a hearing aid. Third, and I'll be damned if I can ever remember what that one is. Thus I must stick closely to my text, or I shall wander all over the place. Actually, there's a fourth serious loss in our physical capabilities, which we old chaps encounter, but we do our utmost not to even think about that one, let alone discuss it, as whenever we do, all we do is sit around and cry. You will note that it is necessary for me to take frequent sips of water, and this is due to the fact that during my indoctrination into Japanese culture, which was administered with severity by clubs of various sizes, all too often I would zig when I should have zagged, and the damage to my throat has finally caught up with me, resulting in my having to have a series of drastic surge throat operations and intense radiation treatments, leaving me with a perpetual dry mouth and throat. So I ask you to bear with me. On 21 April 96, as you've heard, I qualified for the 5th bar of my CD, having completed 62 years of undetected crime in the Canadian services. And hence the greatest part of my life has been spent in the Canadian military. Now, Napoleon once said, "There are no bad men, only bad officers." The question then is, have I been a good or a bad officer? And here there is no set criteria or standard. Some believe that the best measure of success is the rank you attain, but I do not accept this. Some of the finest men I have met, served with, and held in the highest regard were not necessarily those who were the most senior. One thing I do recognize as a measure of success is leadership, as everyone that I have held in high esteem has had that quality, and this I believe to be essential for success in any walk of life. As a member of the armed forces, and regardless of rank, the opportunities for development and use of leadership are immense, and the satisfaction you will derive is equally so. There is still that old adage, however, that you can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make him drink. Of course, the other version, too, where you can lead a horse to drink, but you can't make him water. Thus, while you will have these opportunities, the success you will achieve depends entirely on the amount of effort that you put forth. Nothing is ever free in this life or handed to you on a plate, and the price you must pay is hard work, total effort, and self-sacrifice. I would now like to give you my concept of leadership and the reasons for my beliefs. Incidentally, the most succinct definition of leadership that I've ever heard is being able to tell somebody to go to hell and have them look forward to the trip. If you ever have to lead your troops into combat, and I pray to God this will never happen, you will find that you appear before your men stripped of all insignia and outward signs of authority to command. Your leadership is judged not by your rank, but by whether your men are completely confident that you have the character, knowledge, and training that they can trust you with their lives. Now, men are shrewd judges of their leaders, especially when their lives are at stake, and hence your character and knowledge must be such that they are prepared to follow you, to trust your judgment, and to carry out your commands. Let us now examine those two major things which the men look for in their leaders, and the first is character. And here I believe that the prime ingredient, the absolute cornerstone, is integrity. Integrity is one of those words which many people keep in the desk drawer labeled too hard. It is not a topic for the dinner table or cocktail party. You can't buy or sell it. When supported with education, a person's integrity can give them something to rely on when their perception seems to blur, when rules and principles seem to waver, and when they are faced with the hard choices of right or wrong. It's something to keep them afloat when they are drowning. If for only practical reasons, it is an attribute that should be kept at the very top of a young person's consciousness. Without personal integrity, intellectual skills are worthless. As the ancient Roman philosopher Epictetus said in the field manual he produced for the Roman soldiers in approximately the year 50 A.D., "It is better to die in hunger, exempt from guilt and fear, than it is to live in affluence with perturbation." This means that you must demonstrate the utmost honesty in everything you do in your dealings with superiors and subordinates alike, both on and off duty. It is this that inspires your men to carry out a similar integrity. When they know your word is your bond, then confidence and trust will permeate the entire unit. The men will feel they can come to you, their leader, with the bad news as well as the good news. Never shoot the messenger, as this will just discourage others from giving you the honest feedback needed for you to command. You must report the good, the bad, and the ugly up the chain of command to your superiors. There is no substitute for honesty in our profession. What we do is just too important. Integrity also means having the courage to take the full responsibility for your actions and those of your subordinates. Don't quibble. Don't try to shift the blame. Don't look for scapegoats. If you or your command is fouled up, then fess up and press on. In doing so, you will set the right example for your men and earn the respect of your subordinates and superiors alike. Nothing destroys a unit's effectiveness and leadership quicker than the leaders not taking the sole responsibility for their actions. And the first sign of this is usually careerism or CYA factor, which very often has the tendency to first appear in the higher headquarters. Once started, it rapidly feeds on itself and spreads like wildfire down through the entire organization. At the first indication of this selfish, self-centered, self-serving attitude, you must take every step possible to root it out and replace it with integrity. The second major thing which the men look for in their leaders is knowledge and training. It is essential that you ensure you have the knowledge, information, and training necessary for you to properly assess and solve the problems which will face you and your men. All this must be done to the very best of your ability, regardless of the size or importance of the problem. Never accept the second best or mediocre solution because you think the problem is not worth your time and effort. If you don't have the necessary knowledge and information, then go get it by asking for assistance, advice, guidance, doing research, until you are satisfied that you have everything you need to reach the best solution. Then carry out that solution with your full-out effort and determination. Another point that the men look for in you as their leader is your concern and effort on behalf of the welfare of those who serve under you. You must prove beyond any doubt that you are fair and just in your dealings with them and that you genuinely like and respect them. In all circumstances, you must place their well-being ahead of your own, regardless of the cost to yourself. Finally, one other and perhaps equally important factor is that once you are accepted as a leader, your men will not only follow you, but they will also emulate to the best of their ability your character and behavior. That is why, as a leader, you must at all times and in all places set and maintain the highest of standards. Let us now put these bits and pieces into service life and see the results in actual practice. In doing so, I'd like to use the 3.5 years of life that I spent as a POW to demonstrate the reasons for my belief. The great social historians, the Durants, have said that culture is a thin veneer that superimposes itself on mankind. This is very true. And when men are stripped of this veneer and every other vestige of civilization, are treated and live as animals as we were forced to do as POWs, then the laws of the jungle soon take over. And it is in this environment that the true basics of leadership emerged for me. When I first arrived in Japan, courtesy of the Japanese Navy, I was sent to a special questioning camp under the Japanese Navy at a place called Ofuna, a suburb of Yokohama. This was a special interrogation camp where we were placed in solitary confinement in small cells. No speaking allowed. We were questioned and beaten every day. We were not considered as POWs, but rather we were still on the firing line and could be killed at any time. I was moved from this camp after 6 months when they brought in a U.S. Catalina crew, which was shot down out of Dutch Harbor, and I was sent to the starting up of the working camps in the Yokohama area. The first working camp I went to was located in a baseball stadium in the center of Yokohama, which had been built by the Standard Oil Company. We were housed in a large indoor area under one of the grandstands, and I arrived there the same day as the first batch of prisoners from Hong Kong. There were 5 officers with this group of approximately 300 POWs. Now, in Hong Kong, the Japanese had raped and banded nurses, women, and children. They'd killed doctors and patients in the hospital wards, operating theaters, and recovery rooms. They had bayoneted, mutilated, shot, and beheaded POWs just to amuse themselves. They had humiliated and degraded them in every way possible. No medical treatment or supplies for the sick and wounded, the lowest possible living conditions, and a way below standard diet. We were joined 2 months later by 75 POWs from the Philippines. And these were some of the survivors from the Bataan Death March, where over 16,950 POWs were killed, over 2/3 of the entire total number of POWs involved. All these prisoners, both the Hong Kong and the Philippine POWs, had then to endure the hell ships where thousands died en route from Hong Kong and Manila to Japan. In one ship alone, the Arisan Maru, out of 1,800 POWs, only 8 survived. The Orinoco Maru started out with 1,619 POWs, and only 200 survived that trip. The order sent by the Japanese Tokyo headquarters down to Hong Kong and the Philippine camps was to send their best and healthiest prisoners to work in Japan. Now, as you well know, when a commanding officer gets an order to send his best men, this is when he unloads all his deadbeats, no-gooders, troublemakers, sick, wounded, incompetents, etc. Thus, I found myself to be the senior POW in this brand new working camp, and faced with over 375 very hostile, belligerent POWs. This gave me some concept of how poor old Daniel felt when he walked into that den of lions. I was a senior POW in all the working camps that I was in, but this was a title in name only, as with no means of physically exerting discipline, you had only the vast inherent responsibilities for the health and well-being of all those in the camp, but no means to enforce your decisions. The nature of military discipline encompasses 2 basic forms: the imposed discipline and the discipline which the individual decides is necessary, which is self-discipline. Field Marshal Sir Archibald Wavell, in his book Soldiers and Soldiering, describes this as follows, quote, "Discipline makes a man do something he would not do unless he has learnt that it is the right, the proper, and expedient thing to do. At its best, it is instilled and maintained by pride in oneself, in one's unit, in one's profession, and only at the worst by fear and punishment," unquote. Now, in our case, punishment was completely out of the question. The conditions and environment in which we existed reduced our health to the very razor edge of complete collapse, and we needed every bit of our health, strength, stamina, and reserve to barely keep living from day to day. Having to undergo punishment on top of all this would have been tantamount to issuing a death sentence. Thus, the authority we had was only that which the men wished to give us when and if they felt like it. As officers, we were singled out by the Japanese for special treatment. Every method possible was used to degrade us in front of the men in order to counter any control or discipline we might try to develop. From the men's point of view, all officers were under great suspicion. They felt they had been let down and that the incompetence of their officers was responsible in large part for their being prisoners. Another sad factor was that after being captured, unfortunately, a lot of the officers' prime concern had been for themselves. They had taken the best quarters, furnishings, clothing, and supplies available, and only after they had taken what they wanted or considered their share as an officer did the troops get what was left. This was particularly true in the distribution of food. Since the POWs were on a starvation diet, food was of the greatest importance, as it meant life or death. When the officers took more than their equal share of the daily ration per prisoner, it not only meant that it drastically reduced the food left for the men, but also the men's chances of survival. So the first night we were in the Yokohama camp, we, the 5 officers from Hong Kong and myself, decided that we had to share the privations, maltreatment, and work at least equally with the men, and this could only be done by demonstrating that we took on an obviously greater share than the men. We immediately set up a system whereby the food and everything else that we received was dished out in full view of the men. If anyone thought he had less than an officer, he was free to exchange his share for the officers and no questions asked. The officers were always the last to take up their share. The men tried us on by eating some of their food and then changing it for an officer's bowl, but in no time the troops themselves sorted this out, and woe betide anyone who tried it. In fact, in a way, this backfired, as when the Japanese reduced an officer's ration because he was sick or as punishment, the men themselves made certain that the officer still received his fair and equal share, and in some cases more than his share. Cigarettes became the currency of the POWs, and with the horrible conditions and starvation under which we lived, the addiction to tobacco increased beyond belief. It seemed that when you were smoking, you could, to a limited degree, blot out reality and ease the continual terrible pangs of hunger. Men who were starving, never without intense hunger, 24 hours of the day and every day of the year, knowing that their very lives depended on the small bits of food we got, would still trade away their food for cigarettes. We, the officers, gave up smoking, which was no easy task itself, but in this way we removed ourselves from any criticism and were able to put our ration of cigarettes into the ration for the men, and also to create a small supply for our doctor to be used in keeping the heavily addicted from trading away their food. Anyone offering to buy or sell food for cigarettes was reported by the men themselves to the doctor, who would then talk to those involved and take remedial action. In this way, our lives were made much more bearable and many lives were saved. Another immediate action we took was whenever a Japanese guard started to beat up a prisoner, the closest officer would jump in between them. The prisoner would get lost as quickly as possible, and the officer would take the beating. Sometimes the guard would become bewildered to find he was beating the wrong man and would stop, whereas sometimes he would become infuriated and take it out on the officer. We just had to take our chance and hope for the best. A word about dress and deportment. Clothing was at an absolute premium, as we only had what we had with us when we were captured. The only clothing issue we ever were given was that what the Japanese had captured and then did not want for themselves or could not use in other ways. Believe me, the pickings were very slim indeed, and we lived in rags and tatters. The clothing issues we were given all went to the men, but again, in short order, the men made certain that every officer had one good shirt, tie, tunic, trousers, and hat to wear whenever we had to parade in front of the Japanese. We were given 1 square inch of soap per week with which to do all our laundry and to keep our bodies clean. There was no hot water, and even the cold water was in very limited supply. We were allowed 1 hot and sometimes only a lukewarm bath once a month. The supply of razors, razor blades, hair clippers, scissors, needles, thread, and all other such normal items were only those which had been brought into the camp by the men after their surrender. It was therefore impossible to maintain the normal standards of cleanliness. In addition, we were out of the camp for about 12 hours of the day, doing coolie labor on starvation diet. The result was that we were sick, starving, cold, filthy, infested with lice, fleas, and bed bugs, but unable to find the time, energy, or the means to do very much about it. But despite all this, through the height of ingenuity and improvisation, we still managed to keep ourselves as best we could. When we turned out on parade, it may have been in rags and tatters, but we were as clean, upright, formidable, proud of our heritage, and still as undefeated as we could possibly be. Here may I quote from Field Marshal Slim in writing about his World War II campaign in the jungles of Burma, in which he said, quote, "At some stage and in some circumstances, armies have let their discipline sag, but they have never won victory until they have made it taut again, nor will they. We have found it a great mistake to belittle the importance of smartness in turnout, alertness of carriage, cleanliness of person, saluting, or precision of movement, and to dismiss them as naive, unintelligent, parade square stuff. I do not believe the troops can have unshakable battle discipline without showing these outward signs which mark the pride men take in themselves and their units, and the mutual confidence and respect that exists between them and their officers. It is our experience in a tough school that the best fighting units in the long run were not necessarily those with the advertised reputations, but those who, when they came out of battle, at once resumed a more formal discipline and appearance, unquote. How true, how true. As an indication of what I'm saying, may I draw to your attention that as you tread the streets of Ottawa, unfortunately, you will see all too often the many instances of the state of dress, or should I say undress, of our military, and this causes me very great concern. It was a long, hard process for us POWs, but slowly the confidence, faith, and self-respect was restored not only in the men, but also in ourselves as officers. The first winter in Japan, 1942-43, was the worst, as we tried to climatize ourselves to the living conditions, the cold winter in unheated barracks where we only had one blanket each, and the daily coolie labor, the starvation diet, and the total absence of any medical treatment. Approximately 35% of all the POWs in the working camps in Japan died that winter. And yet in our camp, with its average of 375 POWs, during the first 2 years we lost only 3 men, less than 0.5% per year, giving ample proof of the success of the efforts made by that entire camp. Let us now look at the mutual concern for one another, or comradeship, which we developed, and which is such a vital part of leadership. I believe the good book says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." This, to me, defines the comradeship we developed, and may I give you one example. Medicines were practically non-existent, as we were never given any medical supplies whatsoever by the Japanese. The Red Cross medical supplies sent to Japan for use by the POWs were taken by the Japanese military, repackaged, and sent to their combat troops. After the war, the Allied forces found warehouses all over Japan filled with Red Cross medical, clothing, and food supplies which had been sent for use by the POWs, which had been stored to be used by the Japanese troops in the event of an invasion of their homeland. Our only hope was to pool whatever meager supplies we had in the camp and use them for the maximum benefit of all. This had to be done in complete secrecy, as the Japanese confiscated any medical supplies they found, and treatment of POWs by our own doctor was absolutely forbidden. This presented a very great problem, as everyone hoarded whatever medicines they had. While you may not have the right medicine or drug for wherever illness you encountered, at least you had a chance to barter or trade for the one you did need. On our starvation diet, we had no resistance whatsoever to any disease or infection. We suffered at all times from the ravages of malnutrition and its medical consequences: beriberi, pellagra, blindness, gangrene, etc. Once our doctor got going on secret sick parades, the men soon believed in us and started to turn in their bits and pieces of medical supplies to the doctor. A detailed account was kept of all our camp medical supplies, as to where they came from, who gave them, how much we had, how much was used, and on who. These accounts were available and could be seen at any time by anyone in the camp. One POW from Hong Kong had smuggled in 3 morphine pills, which he turned into the doctor. As these were the only painkillers we had, it was agreed that a unanimous vote of the entire camp would be necessary before one could be used. Now, the reason for this was that you never knew when it might be your turn to need such help to get over that last big painful hump, and hence you'd better have a say as to how and when they were used. Once they were gone, there just wasn't any more. Time and again, the doctor would decide to use a pill in such cases as drastic surgery due to gangrene, as all this had to be done without any anesthetic. He also recommended that they be used in the case of the 3 men we lost just before they died, when there was nothing more we could do for them. In every instance, the unanimous decision was obtained from the camp, only to have it vetoed by the man who was to receive the pill. Now, I was separated from that camp after 2 years, but I understand that those same 3 pills were still unused at the end of the war. A word about our stealing, because this was one of the main ways to our survival. Our camp worked at many various jobs each day, and it was possible on a lot of the jobs to steal things which were not only of great benefit to the camp, but also to the Japanese with whom we worked. A good example was an oil factory where they crushed peanuts, coconuts, soybeans, etc., to make various cooking oils and lubricant oils from castor beans. This was a gold mine for us, as we stole peanuts and coconut for food, and we set up making soap in the boiler plant of the factory by making trays out of old tins, stealing coconut oil and caustic, which we then cooked on top of the boilers. Now, the coolies we worked with knew what we were doing, so we marked trays with their name on it. When their tray of soap was done, we would cut the slab of soap in half and give them half. We would then smuggle our half out of the job and back to camp. We were searched inside the factory by the factory guards before we left the job, and then again outside the camp by the Army guards before we got on the trucks or were marched back to the camp. And then at the camp, we were searched once again inside the camp by the camp guards. Now, if at any time in this entire process we were caught, we never implicated the Japanese workers, and they knew this, so they trusted us even more than they did their own fellow workers. Other items of great value to the Japanese because of the strict rationing, in addition to the soap, was sugar, salt, cooking oil. These items we stole not only from the factories, but also when we were unloading or loading railway cars, ships, and barges. We were able, by stealing on one job and trading with the Japanese coolies with whom we worked on other jobs, to get a meager supply of drugs available on the Japanese market to supplement our meager supplies. As for the men who did the stealing, we set up a system whereby anything of value to the camp, such as food, trade goods, etc., the man doing the stealing would notify the officers, and an officer would go out to work on the job with him. If the man got caught, then the officer would step in and say he had ordered the prisoner to steal. In this way, the officer took the giant share of the bashing, solitary confinement, and other punishment. If the stealing was successful, then half the goods was turned into the camp supplies and used for the sick or to trade with the coolies for medicines. Here again, complete records were kept, and anyone could see them at any time to ensure just how their goods were being used. A few words on the pride and self-respect of the men, no matter what their original background or the results of the degradation and environment in which we existed. I was far from being an ideal prisoner, and when one of the Japanese guards consistently beat up the very sick prisoners, I went after him and beat him into the deck. I shall not go into the aftermath of that affair. Suffice to say, I was extremely lucky to barely survive the punishment and not be killed. When the beating of the sick started up again, the men said I should try something else, as I would never live through that punishment again. So we held a sit-down strike, and after I received a terrible beating, but also the assurance that the sick would not have to go to work, did I give the order for the men to go. My hour of glory was very short-lived, and I was removed from that camp within an hour and sent to an extreme discipline camp at Omori, Tokyo, to show me the error of my ways. There I was set up as a very bad example, and it was the kiss of death for any other prisoner to even look at me in front of the specially selected sadistic guards. For the first 2 weeks, I worked all day sewing bits of fur together, and then all night in the cookhouse. Here, the punishment was to stand on the hot brick ovens in bare feet and holding 2 large buckets of water. Now, with our painful bare feet, this was sheer and utter hell. I slept in little short naps whenever I could, out of the sight of the guards. About this time, the POW camp of Canadians in Yokohama, which had no doctor and whose senior POW was an RSM, ran into a bad session of sickness. A group of the sick were moved to another camp, but en route they stopped off at the discipline camp for a few days. The day they arrived, they heard that I was in camp and that the Canadian sergeant in charge of them came to see me in the shop where the officers were sewing the bits of fur together. He threw the first salute between POWs that had been seen in that camp, and explained that the Canadians had heard about my efforts on behalf of the POWs, and as I was the first Canadian officer that they had met since leaving Hong Kong, they would like to hold a parade for my inspection. I tried to explain what this would mean, but to no avail. Reluctantly, I agreed, and he said they would be formed up in a few minutes. They formed up in the open dirt area which we used for roll calls, parades, and forming of work parties. They were dirty, sick, ragged, starved. Some had to be held up by their comrades, but they were all there. As I expected, no sooner had we got started than the storm broke in all its fury, and the guards came charging into us like a bunch of raving maniacs, swinging fists, clubs, rifle butts, and kicking the daylights out of any of us who fell down. None of us minded, and when it was all over, we'd crawl back into our huts to lick our wounds and have a damn good laugh at the Japanese. I guess one interpretation would be that it was an act of defiance, and that may be right. But bear in mind that these men were from the reserve units out of Montreal and Winnipeg, and in the majority of cases, their military background was practically nil. All had been reduced to the lowest state of civilization possible by their maltreatment and horrible environment, and yet there was a pride in these men such as I've never seen before or expect to see again. It made me proud to be admitted into their ranks. I might add that news of this parade spread like wildfire throughout the working camps in Japan, and the rise in morale amongst the POWs made life hell for the Japanese guards. And the Omori discipline camp was on a small island out in the Tokyo harbor. It was made from silt and sand dredged up from the Tokyo harbor and was about 50 feet from the mainland. There was an anti-aircraft battery on one end and a searchlight battery on the other, with our camp sandwiched in between. We were housed in the standard prefabbed single-story wood buildings used by the Japanese military, and we were right opposite the main fighter base at Haneda Airport, which protected the Tokyo-Yokohama area. With no markings whatsoever to show that we were POWs, we were extremely vulnerable. And so whenever a single B-29 came over, obviously on a photo wrecking, we would run out into the open parade square, and unbeknownst to the Japanese, we would form the letters POW in hopes that this would show up on their photos. The fire bombings and firestorms wiped out the entire area around our camp, and the only thing that saved us was that 50 feet of water separating us from the mainland. The whole area all around us was as flat as a pancake, exactly like our Northland after a big forest fire. With no food, water, electricity, or places to work, the Japs started to move some of us out into the outlying areas. And as I was one of the bad actors, I was one of the first to go. They took a bunch of us from the various camps in the Tokyo area and put us into railway boxcars where we were so jammed that we had to take turns standing and sitting. It was cold, no food, water, or sanitation facilities, and we were there for well over 48 hours. Many of us had amoebic dysentery or diarrhea, and life soon became grim, to say the least. We were taken up into the mountains northwest of Tokyo, and here we ended up on a siding where we were able to get out and lie down on the ground. And this was the first opportunity I had to see what prisoners were there, their physical condition, and then the sad realization that once again I was the senior POW. There was a total of 280 POWs, a real mixed bag, and the physical condition was the worst I had ever seen. Some were blind from lack of vitamin A, some had lost a foot hand from beriberi, followed by gangrene. All were skin and bones from prolonged malnutrition. As we were the first batch out of the Tokyo camps, the commandants once again had unloaded all their sick invalids and misfits. We were now jammed onto flatbed trucks and taken off to our camp way up in the mountains at a place named Suwa. It was high in the mountains and it was cold, especially at night, when we might even have a thin coating of ice on any open water. The camp was only half built. Some of the buildings had no roof, some had no sidewalls. There was no kitchen, cooking, or sanitation facilities. The wiring consisted of a single line running through the camp with 1 or 2 40-watt bulbs in each building. It was pouring rain. Everyone was soaked, cold, miserable, starving, and filthy beyond belief. The barracks were of little protection as there was no straw on the bare boards for us to lie on, and the floors were just pure mud. The next day we tried to fix up the camp. We found that we were on the side of a mountain which was all terraced with rice and vegetable paddies. Our main water supply was a small creek which ran down through the paddies and then through the camp. Since the fertilizer they used was human excreta, we had to set up a system to at least boil all our drinking water. We tried to make our barracks as airtight as possible with mud, straw, and grass, as we had no heat whatsoever, and we set up the most basic washing and latrine facilities. The work details started at once. The prisoners left the camp at 7 a.m. each morning, walked down the side of our mountain and up the side of the next one to get to an open-faced mine where they dug out the ore, which was some kind of white metal. The path between the camp and the mine was all rough, broken stone, and with no shoes, only wooden clogs, the number of seriously infected feet went completely out of control. Our food ration was the lowest I had encountered, and with no medicines or medical treatment, this was indeed a death camp. It was our conservative but very well considered estimate that we would be extremely lucky if just one of us was going to survive that coming winter of 1945. As the war started to go against the Japanese and the Allies began their island-hopping advance toward Japan, the orders had gone out from Tokyo headquarters to all the military that they were never to retreat, but rather fight to the last man, even with suicidal attacks. Kamikaze aircraft were a very good example of this philosophy. Also, the orders were that at the first sign of a landing and attack on their area, they were to kill all the POWs, internees, sick, wounded, incompetents, etc., so that every able-bodied Japanese could fight to the death without hindrance. In the POW camps, we had to dig trenches, and machine guns were placed at each end. We were then to be marched into the trenches, doused with gasoline, and set on fire. Anyone trying to escape would be killed by the machine guns. Proof of this policy was more than evident in the Japanese-occupied islands, which were overrun by the Americans, when we then found all the POWs, sick and wounded, both captives and Japanese, all massacred by the Japanese as they retreated. The Japanese surrender, we took over our camp to ensure our survival and concentrated on getting ourselves physically fit enough to get out of there and get into the hands of the Allies. We took over all the food we could find and ran the kitchen on a 24-hour basis. We bought a pig, a horse, and a cow, which we slaughtered and put into the stew pot. Believe me, everything went in with the possible exception of the skin and hooves. We scoured the countryside for all the medical supplies we could beg, borrow, buy, or just expropriate so that our doctor and his helpers could work day and night to bring the seriously ill back to as good health as possible. We got yellow paint and painted big POW signs on the roofs of our buildings. We made flags out of old bed sheets and colored them with crayons. We put these up on flagpoles, and then we waited. The U.S. Navy planes soon found us, and we were showered with bundles from heaven containing clothing, food, medicines, and goodies such as cigarettes and chocolate bars. When the doctor felt we were as fit as he could get us, we made our move and came out overnight by train to Tokyo. When we couldn't find any Allied forces near the Tokyo railway station, we moved over to the station for the electric train and went on to Yokohama. Here we went outside the station, sat down, flew our flags on some bamboo poles we had liberated. Now, it was not all that easy. You must remember we had some prisoners who were blind, some minus a foot or hand, some unable to walk on painful feet from beriberi, and all of us at the end of our endurance. Thus, we had to commandeer trucks, wagons, bicycle trailers, anything that we could lay our hands on to carry our sick and invalids. The healthiest POWs carried the Japanese guards' rifles just in case we met up with trouble, as once we left the relatively safe confines of our camp, we were on our own, and God help us. We didn't have long to wait outside the Yokohama station before a jeep came by with a U.S. Army officer and a big radio on it. We identified ourselves. Chap got on his radio, and we were soon inundated with buses, trucks, and ambulances, which took us down to a reception center set up in the Yokohama docks. We were then told to get out and go into the dock area. Next thing I knew, our senior POW NCO called the troops to attention, formed them up into marching order,
turned the parade over to me, and we marched into the dock area with our homemade flags flying. We were dirty, tired clothing. But we were defiant, proud. The first thing was to strip us all of our clothes and to throw them into an incinerator. Next, they removed all our body hair and put us through a delousing station. From there, into a hot shower with lots of hot water and soap. While stark naked, we were confronted by a horde of doctors and nurses who segregated us into groups depending on our medical condition, then into a room with all the clothes in the world where we could take as much of everything as we wanted. Finally, we were given a thorough interrogation by a team of intelligence and war crimes officers. All the time this was going on, there were Red Cross girls going around dishing out cigarettes and chocolate bars. I was taken to the hospital ship USS Marigold as I was out on my feet and don't even remember going on board. I do recall that I was taken to a cabin with a head all to myself. This was the first time since being captured that I was all on my own except when I had been in solitary. I had pajamas, clean ones too, the first time in 3.5 years. I was really clean and clear of lice, fleas, bed bugs, the first time in 3.5 years, and finally had absolutely no responsibility for anyone other than myself, the first time in 3.5 years. Now, our camp was unique in having 100% survival from the instant that the war ended until we were recovered by the Americans. Now, this is only due to the full-out cooperation and self-discipline of all the men in that camp. By way of explanation, the Americans were very cautious and stayed in the Yokohama dock area until they were certain that the Japanese military and civilians would accept the surrender and not kill the POWs and internees as they had been ordered to do. A large part of the Japanese military would not accept the surrender and vowed to fight to the finish. While there was also a tremendous number of civilians who had lost members of their family, especially in the firebombing, who were still very hostile. For those POWs who were inland, such as ourselves, you either had to wait a long period of time to be recovered or try to beat your way out. I'm afraid that in the majority of camps it was every man for himself. And in a lot of cases, that was fatal. The civilians retaliated, as did the military. Some POWs ate poisonous food and drank wood alcohol and died. Others started out on journeys far beyond their physical capability and died en route to freedom. You must remember that it was most difficult, if not impossible, to control men who had been through 4 years of sheer and utter hell, especially when there was absolutely no way of enforcing any discipline. During the war, over 30% of all the POWs and internees taken by the Japanese were either killed or died in the POW camps. And thus, they never did make it home. Here, I think that the epitaph on the memorial in the Allied War Graves Cemetery in Kohima, Burma, where over 1,500 Allied servicemen are buried, sums it up very well. Quote, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today," unquote. Catchphrases are wonderful things. And by way of trying to summarize this whole thing, if I had to use one to define my concept of leadership, it would be the 3 C's. First, character. It is my firm belief that the true and solid foundation is integrity. Or as Shakespeare had Polonius say in Hamlet, "This above all else to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, that thou canst not then be false to any man." Say what you mean, which is the telling of the truth as against the telling of lies, and then mean what you say, which is integrity. Having the moral fiber to face the issues of right and wrong, and then the courage to stand up firm and strong, regardless of the consequences to yourself. Second, competence. Having the necessary knowledge, education, training, and judgment, and to make full use of them, no matter how large or small the problem, to ensure that you have given it your fullest consideration. Once you have done this and made your decision, then to carry it out to the very best of your ability. Know what you're doing and how to do it. Third, comradeship. Take a full interest in your subordinates, having true respect and concern for them, to the extent that at all times and in all circumstances you put their welfare and well-being ahead of your own, regardless of the cost or inconvenience to yourself. Once these are firmly in place, then the other important aspects, such as discipline and self-discipline, pride in yourself and in your unit, self-respect and respect for both your superiors and subordinates, proper dress and deportment at all times, all these will develop and strengthen as they feed on one another until what I call true leadership emerges. Now live by these precepts, and as a member of the Canadian Forces devoted to the well-being of your fellow Canadians and the preservation of our Canadian way of life, you will not only attain true self-respect, but also the respect of everyone with whom you associate. You can never have a better goal in life. Canada needs our Canadian forces, they who will be the leaders, the protectors and defenders of our country in the years 2000 AD. It needs their youth, courage and energy, but there's also a desperate need for their self-discipline, their discipline of the mind, their character, their integrity, in short, their leadership. As I examine and work with the Canadian Forces, I have absolutely no qualms about the future of our services. Admiral Bull Halsey, a famous World War II admiral of the U.S. fleet in the Pacific, once said, "There are no great men. There are only great challenges ordinary men are forced by circumstances to meet." As the history of our services prove, there has never been, nor will there ever be, any shortage of ordinary men and women in our forces who are ready, willing, and most capable to take up the challenges they will be forced to face. If I may borrow the RCAF motto, per ardua ad astra, through adversity to the stars. This is the heritage which you have been entrusted into the hands of our Canadian forces. May they guard it well, as I have every confidence they will. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an honor and a privilege to have shared these thoughts with you. Bonne chance et merci bien.
The citation for the Order of the British Empire for gallantry reads, in part, "As senior Allied officer in the camps in which he was located, he continually displayed the utmost concern for the welfare of his fellow prisoners. On many occasions, with complete disregard for his own safety, he prevented as far as possible Japanese officials from sadistically beating his men and denying prisoners the medical attention which they so urgently needed. Typical of his splendid gallantry was when, in the Yokohama camp, he called a sit-down strike in protest against ill treatment of his men. On another occasion, when the Japanese wanted to send some sick prisoners of war to work, Squadron Leader Birchall found it necessary, at great personal risk, to prevent forcibly the Japanese non-commissioned officer in charge from making these prisoners work. As a result, Squadron Leader Birchall spent several days in solitary confinement. Nevertheless, the sick prisoners of war did not have to work. Knowing that each time he forcibly intervened on behalf of his men, he would receive brutal treatment, Squadron Leader Birchall endeavored to improve the lot of his fellow prisoners. He also maintained detailed records of personnel. The consistent gallantry and glowing devotion to his fellow prisoners of war that this officer displayed throughout his lengthy period of imprisonment are in keeping with the finest traditions of the Royal Canadian Air Force.